Thank you for inviting me and for this nice introduction. Okay, so what I want to do today is to ask two questions, basically. One, trying to give you a clue of what happened in the Netherlands in the last, well, 20 to 30 years, especially when it comes to the shift to a much more anti-immigrant rhetoric and anti-multiculturalism rhetoric. How is this possible? This, of course, was a question that many people in abroad asked themselves when Pim Fortuyn became an important politician in the second half of the 1990s, and everyone was asking me and other Dutch colleagues who went abroad, what's happening in the Netherlands? You were this nice example of a multiculturalism, and now hey, you turn to be so xenophobic, and so what the hell is happening at the coasts of the North Sea? So I will try to answer that question to some extent, and also the question to what extent it did indeed really, let's say, the shift in politics and also in rhetorics did also change the integration process itself, but also the underlying, let's say, day-to-day policies. So that would be one issue that I want to address. The other issue is, being in the UK, I will also try to explain to what extent what happened in the Netherlands, not only with the shift to populism and anti-immigrant populism, but also the preceding migration dynamics from, well, the late 1950s onwards, and to compare this to the developments in the United Kingdom and see what is specific about what we see happening in the Netherlands and, well, where are the similarities. And for example, why is there no Geert Wilders or Pim Fortuyn in the UK, at least not in the way how influential they are in the Netherlands. And I think that in order to answer such questions, historical analyses are crucial. And I will, by the way, explain to you, none of you being historians, I assume, that I see history very much as a social science, not so much as something very different from what social scientists do. Because at least in the field I'm working in, I ask the same kind of questions that you ask yourself. The only difference being that I'm interested in developments and changes over time. So time and periodization is, I think, what historians are good at. And what interests me most is, let's say, comparisons in time and over time. So to what extent, if you want to understand what is happening today, it is very useful to see, to compare with previous periods, and only then you can make a balanced assessment to what extent what is happening now is new or is unprecedented. So this is one of the things I did, for example, in a book I published in 2005, which is called The Immigrant Threat, in which I compared, let's say, the big immigrations in Western Europe at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century with those in more current periods up until today. Especially because many people who now live, but also many social scientists, because they have too little knowledge about previous examples of migration, too easily assume that what is happening in their time is unique and is unprecedented. For example, transnationalism or all these kind of things. Historians will always say, okay, wait a minute, we've seen it before. Which is not, I mean, this is one typical reaction of a historian, which also has its problems, because it becomes a too easy answer sometimes. So what we really have to do is to what extent things are different, to what extent are they similar. So this is where I come from. Okay, so I'm going to talk today, I'm not going to talk about global migration history, one of my other projects, but I'm going to talk about this book, which is published in Dutch. And the English title would read something like Winners and Losers, a Balanced Account of 5 Centuries of Immigration. I will not bother you with the 5 centuries, but I'll stick to 50 years or so. And I'll use it as a kind of as a way also to make these comparisons with the developments in the UK. So in order to understand, again, to come back to the first question, so what was happening, why this dramatic shift from this the Netherlands as the example of multiculturalist policies to the Netherlands as the example of xenophobia, which we still see very much today. Well, in order to understand, we have to go back a little bit in time with this very important politician. Pim Fortuyn, you all know, he was killed in 2003 by an environmentalist activist. Pim Fortuyn became popular and well known in the course of the 1990s while writing for a well-known weekly in which he very much started to write against Islam, against Islamization, against immigration in general. Of course, it should read as Islam, not Islam. This was at the time perceived as something not done and very anti-political correct, etc. But he was able in a very short time to become quite popular and well known with these kind of expressions, and it also helped him for his political career, because he did not start out as a politician. He used to be an academic for some time. He even held a special chair for a couple of years before he catapulted himself into the more public discussion and into politics. So this is the shift from, let's say, the Netherlands as the world champion multiculturalism to world champion xenophobia is very much to do with the rise of Pim Fortuyn in the 1990s. But of course, the explanation is not one person. I mean, historians have gone beyond the, let's say, the one-person explanation, whether it's Napoleon or Pim Fortuyn. Of course, there are more structural forces working, which made it also able for Fortuyn to mobilize these kind of sentiments. Fortuyn has been hugely important and is one of the examples of what in our book we call, integration pessimists. And these let's say all these people, I'll introduce them very briefly in a moment, became well known and very dominant in the public domain and in public discussions from the 1990s onwards. So the people we see here, well, Pim Fortuyn on the left bottom. Left upper is Martin Bosma, who is the party ideologist of Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom. The middle, you may know Frits Bolkestein, who's a liberal politician, also Euro-commissionary for a number of years, and a very well-known figure in the Liberal Party, also used to lead the Liberal Party. This is Paul Scheffer, you may know him from publications, a member of the Labour Party. So the interesting thing about this is that they, let's say, it comes from different political directions, when it comes to people who voice this pessimism. Then in the middle also a member of the Dutch Labour Party, Hilda Verwij Jonko, the La Grande Dame of the Dutch Social Democracy, who in her later age became very pessimistic, especially about Islam and how the Muslims would take over the world, etc. These kind of rhetorics. And then on the right at the bottom, Pieter Lakenman, who is a publicist who also became known by a book in which he denounced the Dutch immigration and integration policies. So these are 6 figures who became or spokesmen, and mostly men, no, only one woman, who started to dominate the debate about immigration and integration from the mid-1990s onwards, and especially from the turn of the century, around 2000. The interesting thing is, if you analyze their work, is that it contains lots of opinions, but only barely any facts. And when there are facts in their writings, that's also why, by the reason why I did not show you Geert Wilders, because he doesn't write. So we thought, well, let's first analyze what the arguments is, on what the arguments are based. And then, again, as I said, it's very striking how little empirical evidence or data, well, what we do, is there in the books. And if they have data, it's mostly very selective or twisted, and etc. So, of course, this does not mean, per definition, that they are wrong. Right? You can have opinions without facts who still are true. But we decided for our book to test at least the main assumptions that we came across in this book with the, well, with in mind Patrick Moynihan's maxim that everyone is entitled to his own opinion but not to his own facts. So let's talk about facts, we thought. Well, if you then analyze their works, their written works, then it is striking that they converge in a large way. Although, again, as I said, these people come both from the left, from the Labour Party, and from the right. Pim Fortuyn and people who have started on the left and ended on the right, like Pim Fortuyn. So it's a very mixed lot in that sense, or strange bedfellows to some extent. It's striking how they agree about most things. And these are only 5 of the claims. There are more claims, but I'll restrict myself to these 5. One has to do with the future, very much about this fear of Muslims, fear of Islam, and I'll go into that in a moment. 2 claims have more to do with the present, at least the present at the time that they wrote their books or pamphlets, which is that the Netherlands is threatened by mass immigration of especially non-Western immigrants, and that the government should do something about it, and if they don't do something about it, well, there will be Armageddon waiting around the corner. The third claim is that integration policies that started at the end of the 1970s, beginning of the 1980s, have utterly failed. And then, of course, it's interesting to see, okay, who is to blame? What are the causes of this awful situation in which we find ourselves now, with all these threatening Muslims and mass immigration and failed integration, etc. Who can we blame? Well, that's quite clear for these persons. It's the left, or what Pim Fortuyn called the leftish church. So even people from the left, like Paul Scheffer, who still is a member of the Labour Party in the Netherlands, blames, let's say, at least segments of his party who he sees as cosmopolitan, people who are the cosmopolites, people who are the elites, who do not really know what the people and the workers would like what their interests are. Also, so not only the left is to blame for this mass immigration that we see especially in the 70s and 80s in the Netherlands, also partly in the 90s, but the left is also to blame when it comes to this utterly failed integration policies, because the idea among the integration pessimists is that the one main reason why integration has failed is because it was based on a wrong idea, the idea that people would, whatever culture they had, that all these cultures were more or less equal, and that you could not really demand from immigrants to adapt to, let's say, the main culture of the country where they settle, in this case the Netherlands, or what the Germans call a Leitkultur. So this is what all of these integration pessimists have in common. Well, some of them are more radical, like Martin Bosma from the PVV. Others are let's say, more formulated in a more moderate way, but basically they do agree upon these 5 claims. So what we in the book do is, okay, we don't find evidence in their books, but maybe they're right, maybe they're not. Let's just look at the facts. What do we know? Especially we as academics, and that's because we are being paid to gather facts and to have some kind of objective, to produce some objective knowledge, and that's also the function of academics, and that's why, let's say, taxpayers give us money to do this. Okay, so that was what we then started to do. So let's look at the first claim, Muslims posing a threat. Well, as you all know, this is not specifically Dutch. This is a quite international movement of people who argue that Muslims and radical Islam is very dangerous. Bat Ye'orva, for example, Israeli writer, but well, here people like Christopher Caldwell, Bernard Lewis, who was a very distinguished Arabist, by the way, but also in his later days became very, very pessimistic about, and also very essentialist about what Muslims are, and what Islam is, and that it was unchangeable, and that they always try to conquer the Christians, and that we should be very much aware. And also this Thilo Sarrazin, who wrote this book, Deutschland schafft sich ab, so Germany does away with itself. Is that how would you translate it? Anyway, this was a book that he's also, by the way, a social democrat. So it's interesting, these left-right combinations. His book sold more than 1 million copies, and he has a very alarmistic prognosis for the future, and also has these demographics in it. So what will the part of how many Muslims will live in Germany in 2050 if we don't do anything about it now? So it's very much, it's now a few minutes before 12, and if we don't act now, then, well, some people take this very literally, like Anders Breivik, and then start shooting. It's interesting if you analyze Breivik's written work. Well, it's cut and paste to a large extent, but if you look at this document that he has on the internet, it's interesting to see that it's not so different from what these people write, only the conclusions that he draws from these conclusions is quite different. Well, of course, in the Netherlands, the main representative since 2003, 2004 is Geert Wilders. Interesting to see how moderate he was about Islam around 2000, all kind of citations that he does not want to be remembered by. But he has radicalized very quickly when he started to leave the Liberal Party and start his party of freedom of his own. Okay, so what about it? Should we be afraid of Muslims and Eurabia and all these kind of things? Well, I will not linger on this very long. We all know that this is nonsense. For two reasons. There is no evidence at all that, let's say, there is a kind of a conspiracy of Muslims who want to take over Europe, which is in this idea of Eurabia. We know that Islam is a very heterogeneous lot. Of course, there are extremists with crazy ideas, as all extremists of whatever ideology there are. But there is no evidence at all that, let's say, the central values of European societies when it comes to freedom of speech and equality, gender equality, or equality between heterosexuals and homosexuals, etc., that this is really endangered by, let's say, the Muslims, whoever they are. The second, so in that sense, let's say, what you see is that it very much is alike other conspiracy theories, especially when it comes to anti-Semitism, for example, but also anti-Catholicism. Here you see a typical Catholic family from the 1950s. Well, I can tell you so because I'm from a family of 9. I have 6 sisters and 2 brothers. Then the accusation was that Catholics did this in order to become much more populist than the Protestants in the Netherlands. So this is a accusation that's quite old, and if you analyze anti-Catholicism, especially in the UK when it comes to anti-immigrant sentiments versus Irish migrants, but also in the US from the 1840s onwards, it's almost identical with the anti-Muslim rhetoric. Now you just replace Catholic by Muslim, and you have exactly the same kind of accusations. Well, I can imagine, I can assure you that whatever motives my parents had to have 10 children, because one Leo died at a very young age, I don't think when they were in bed they had in mind in order to beat the Protestants in a demographic sense. If you look at demographic figures now, it's clear that for the Netherlands, for example, the youngest cohorts of Turkish women have less children than, let's say, the average. I mean, you see that this adaptation to demographic adaptation of the younger cohorts of immigrants in the Netherlands and also in other parts of Europe is going very fast now. So all these extrapolations are based on, especially on fear and not so much on what we know, on facts. So that claim can very easily be rejected. Well, when it comes to being threatened by mass immigration, okay, well, what we did in our book is to ask ourselves, okay, what is then mass immigration, and when do we start? Well, we thought, okay, let's just take the definition of the populists. Let's take Geert Wilders' definition, which reads as, we can speak about mass immigration when at least 25,000 people from non-Western countries are added to the total stock of the population in 1 year. We can have a long debate whether this is mass immigration. The Netherlands has some 16 million inhabitants, by the way. Okay, let's just accept this definition and see if from the period that people start talking about mass immigration, it's very interesting to see that immigration is going down considerably. We even have a deficit around 2005. So more people leaving for Morocco, Turkey, whatever country, than people coming in from these countries. Yes, it is then increasing again without until today reaching its threshold. So it's interesting to see what is happening is not so much mass immigration, at least, but talking about mass immigration. One of the big advantages of our age, and not when I was studying in the 1980s, is that you have these internet and you have databases, so you can calculate very, very quickly how often the term mass immigration is being used in Dutch weeklies or daily journals. Well, that's the purple, that's this one. So here it really explodes talking about mass immigration. But this is what really is happening in, let's say, in terms of numbers. So what you see is that in the Netherlands, let's say the talking about mass immigration has increased dramatically, especially in before the last parliamentary elections. But that's the facts behind it, the demographic facts, do not add up at all. So that's one, but then it's also interesting to see, okay, who are we then talking about? Because there is this assumption that non-Western immigrants are always bad. Nobody wants non-Western immigrants. That's what you should avoid. Okay, who are these non-Western immigrants? Well, first of all, you cannot see that in this table, but 10% of all these non-Western immigrants are adoption children. Nobody talks about that. Colombia, China, whatever, often from non-Western countries. And if you then look at where all these people come from, what is striking is especially its heterogeneity, both when it comes to where people come from, but also their skills, for example. There are a lot of these non-Western immigrants are high-skilled immigrants who work for high-tech companies like ASML, Philips, who are, because they are not there in the Netherlands enough, so they are being exported from countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, China, wherever the Dutch capital can get them, they try to lure them into the Netherlands with high salaries. So this is also part of the, let's say, the non-Western immigrants, but not, let's say, in the minds of people, because when they hear non-Western immigrants, it's a code word for, let's say, poor, stupid Muslims. Okay, let's look at the poor, stupid Muslims. Somalia, Turkey, and Morocco are, let's say, the main countries of origin. Well, is this mass immigration? I mean, these are the figures added to the total stock. 100 Moroccans more in 100 more than 2007 when compared to 2008, 900 then more in 2009. Well, if you don't like Moroccans, 100 Moroccans more is 100 Moroccans too many. I understand that. But talking about mass immigration, I think this is really too much. So if you really look at, let's say, even if you buy the argument of the anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim rhetorics, even then we are talking about very low numbers. So that was, let's say, claim number two. Okay, then integration. Well, that's a more, there's more to say about that. Integration, the idea now among the Dutch population, or at least large segments, is that integration has failed. And that this is especially expressed in the high levels of unemployment, criminality, very low attainments in education, especially of the second generation, or the children of the immigrants. Well, and also that many of these children then become engage in orthodox ideas about Islam, so they also in a cultural sense do not really integrate into the Dutch state. Well, first of all, we have to recall again that this is a very selective view, because this is only, of course, applies to certain groups of immigrants. Yeah? So, and that's one of the problems you see in this discussion, is that immigrants, the definition of who an immigrant is, almost necessarily conflates with, let's say, people with problems. Yeah? So if you say, well, what about migrants from the UK or from Germany? They're not immigrants. I mean, we're not talking about them. So everyone who does not fit this problematic picture is defined out of it. So, and that, of course, then you get a very easily a self-fulfilling prophecy. But okay, let's then look at these groups. So for the Netherlands, we're talking especially about descendants of former guest workers from Turkey, from Morocco mainly. Both groups are almost equally large, of 350,000 people, talking about first and second generation. So. But also people from the ex-colonies, especially from Suriname, but also the Antilles Islands and the Caribbean. These are the groups that, let's say, that also the policy focuses on. Well, first of all, it is undeniable that there are all kinds of social problems. It's undeniable that when you make comparisons between, let's say, the second generation of these groups and the second generation of the Dutch, that the Dutch always win. This is not so strange, because the Dutch is one big, let's say, is everyone. It's not being controlled for a social class, for example. We don't have these statistics. So in that sense, the immigrants can never win this game. So they always look bad. This is not to say that there are no real problems, because there are, especially, for example, Moroccan male youth between, let's say, 14 and 25, who it is clear that they are much more represented in certain types of crime than, let's say, other people, also other immigrant groups. But in order to have a real balanced view about this, and also to understand how these problems came about, we really have to remember what the starting position of this integration process was. And this is something which is often forgotten. And the starting position was a very bad one. This is what you see here, this is for Moroccans, but you get the same kind of picture when you put in the data for the Turks. Oh, I see it's in Dutch. Okay, so this is immigration per year from Morocco. So this is the, then there's the immigration to Morocco, but that's very low in this period. And the black line, that's where, let's say, the drama lies, you could say, which is unemployment among Moroccans in the Netherlands. So not the general, and that's, let's say, this scale. So you see that in the second half of the 1980s, more than half of the Moroccans in the Netherlands is out of work. It does not have a job. What is especially striking about this graphic, this figure, is what you here see is something unprecedented. And that's why historians, I think, are important. If you look at the last 500 years of immigration in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands has a very interesting immigration history with 2 centuries of mass immigration between 1600 and 1800, for example. This is unprecedented. Why? Because you have mass immigration, yes, this is really mass immigration, in a period of economic downturn, yeah, economic recession. And this is very weird because immigrant migration mostly works on economic incentives, high wages, demand for labor, etc. So I'll explain why this happened in a moment, but it is very important to realize that the bulk of the migrants who are now seen as having failed in their integration, and this is, by the way, not only the former guest workers, but also the people from Suriname to some extent and from the Antilles, and this was in the same period, especially when Suriname became independent in 1975. There was a mass exodus to the Netherlands of the people who wanted to beat the ban, like the West Indians, for example, in the UK the early 60s. So this situation is the beginning. So you couldn't imagine a worse starting point of the integration, because what you see here, especially for Moroccans and Turks who had been selected on low skills, we did not want to, let's say, too high skilled people from these areas, who arrive, especially their families arrive at the moment that the husbands lose their jobs, have bad housing, in very segregated neighborhoods, do not know the society well, because that was not expected of them, because they would return, had a very bad command of the language, could not really guide their children in this society, and in a very long recession, we now know from the hindsight. So that this would lead to problems is clear. I mean, if this could not result in a very quick and successful integration. That would have been a miracle. So I think in order to evaluate, let's say, the position now of the second generation, you have to keep this in mind. So it's both a social and economic background of this immigration. And then, if you realize the bad starting point and bad timing of this immigration, it's remarkable how many of their children are doing well. How, let's say, the percentage of children who are now reaching higher education and be at the university, etc. Again, this is not to deny that there are a lot of problems, but again, you could not expect anything else given this timing of the immigration. So that leads to the question, and also to another further claim of the pessimists. Okay, why did this happen? How to explain, because it never happened before. So something must have been different. Well, the pessimists, they have an easy answer. As I said, because the left is to blame. They somehow opened the floodgates in the mid-70s and said, okay, guys, girls, come in. You're all welcome, whatever skills you have, no problem. So this is really seen as a kind of a deliberate conspiracy of good doers, leftish people who thought, okay, of course, who are we to read? Well, this is not what happened at all. If you really analyze what happened in the 1970s, even under the most leftish cabinet that the Netherlands ever had, between 1973 and 1977, it was exactly this government who, with the oil shock crisis in 1973, decided to stop recruiting guest workers and to close the borders. That was a very clear message that they brought about. These were leftish politicians who did so. Nevertheless, this did not help, this did not stop the immigration. In order to understand why it did not stop immigration, it's not, let's say, the conspiracy idea that is convincing. And it's also interesting to see that the most leftish politicians in parliament were against guest worker migration in principle, because they saw this as a conspiracy of capital to bring in very low wage labor. So they were against it as well. So it's not the leftist church. There are three factors that are responsible for, let's say, this reversed migration dynamic that I showed. Two of these factors were already in place in the early 1960s, but would only become evident 15 years or so later. One is that the Liberal Party, the right-wing party, backed up by the social by Christian democratic parties, at the beginning of the guest worker program, successfully boycotted the idea that there had to be a rotation system. So the idea was get Ahmed from the Rif Mountains to the Netherlands. He can work for 2 years and then he has to leave again, and then Mustafa can take his place. So in order to prevent that people rooted and became real immigrants. Well, the employer said, we're not going to do this. By the time that Ahmed knows what to do, he has to go, I have to ship him back, and we have to learn the ropes for someone else. So they very successfully, so this never became practice in the Netherlands. The result being that people could stay on, and this was, of course, les 30 glorieuses. There was economic boom, unprecedented. So, and by staying on, these guest workers not only acquired social and economic rights, because they paid premiums for pensions, for sickness, for unemployment, etc., because they were part of the welfare system. So they entered the welfare system, and by doing that build up their social rights. But also their residential rights, their legal rights as an alien also became very strong, because after 5 years as a legal alien, it was almost impossible to send people back, also when they became unemployed. Well, this is something that neither the guest workers nor most Dutch policymakers realized at that time. But the long-term effects were already in place. Let's say the basis of it was already in place in 1960. Then also very interesting, and Saskia Bonjour, my colleague now at Leiden, has shown this in her dissertation on migration and family politics, that at the same time, there was, at the beginning of the 1960s, there was a big row in Parliament because the border police had refused spouses of Spanish guest workers at the border and sent them back. And this became a public thing, and then especially the Catholic party said, well, this is a scandal. How can you deny people the right of a family and I mean, from their family ideology. So all the Christian parties were very much against this restrictive aliens policy. And very soon, of course, the liberals backed them up, because we were in competition to get as many as possible guest workers with Belgium and Germany and France. So they wanted to have the most open policies possible. So already in the early 1960s, the principal right of family reunification was codified. Again, not many people used this right at that time, because all the guest workers thought we were going back. But it was in place. It was only mobilized in the mid-1970s, when the leftist government decided to close the borders and to end the recruitment policies. Well, this sent a message that had a very different effect than, let's say, policymakers had envisioned. Because it was only then that most of these guest workers, especially those from outside of Europe, because Italians by then already had free, like the Poles now in the Netherlands, they could already go in and out freely. So there was, but for the Moroccans and the Turks, this meant that, and they also realized that if they would leave in 1973, 74, 75, they would never get back in. So the results of this policy were exactly the opposite what the policymakers would wanted to accomplish. Because Turks and Moroccans realized that they would give up all the rights that they had built up. Going back was not a very attractive option, because unemployment was staggering high in these countries. And so they stayed on, and because they had been detached from their families for such a long time, then they started to use this right, which already was in place 50 years before, to bring over their families. So what you then get, so this in the 1970s, and especially 1980s, and also until the 1990s, is mass immigration in a period that economically you would not expect it. Yeah? So this very much has to do with the role of the state and the role of the welfare state. And this is really different, because there was no welfare state in the past, and the state only started to become involved in migration controls in the 20th century. Before that, also nation states, before the World War I, couldn't care less, at least most states. There are some examples at the Prussian-Polish border in the 19th century. Most states, like the Netherlands, they did not involve themselves in migration controls. And of course, we have these examples also for the United States, with the Mexican border, where we know that all these fences do not stop the migrants, but what they do stop is migrants going back. And so it's also there the opposite of what people want to accomplish. Okay, so this is more or less, I think, what happened in the Netherlands, and I think this is, by the way, also not only for the Netherlands, this is a very general mechanism that you see throughout continental Western Europe, especially for, it's not so much for the colonial migration, because they have their own dynamics, and I'll talk about that when it comes to the UK in a moment, but for the non-colonial guest worker labor migrations, this is to understand this reverse migration dynamics, these are the main drivers of it. Okay, let's then briefly look at the claim about failed migration policies and the, let's say, kind of a leftish, naive, crazy multiculturalist policies. And, well, to start with, this was not a leftish program. This was a broadly shared from left to right program that, okay, maybe we hadn't chosen for these Turks and Moroccans and others to come to the Netherlands, but once they were here, we had to take good care of them. And we should be very much aware not to discriminate them and to make them a kind of a scapegoat for anti-immigrant politicians. So, and that's also where this rhetoric about, let's say, preserving one's own cultural identity, and that's also the kind of idea of the Dutch integration policy. So integration, we expected them, yes, to integrate and to become more similar than us, especially in social and economic respects, but they could retain their own cultural identity as long as it didn't really clash with the central norms in the Netherlands. Well, this was not left. This was broadly shared, and moreover, the policies, let's say the high days of the policies were the 1980s, which were dominated by center-right governments, and there was no leftish politician at all responsible for this. What is interesting, nevertheless, is to see that criticism on immigration or criticism about the social problems that went with this immigration, and there were a lot of social problems, especially in the 1980s, because the economy was doing so bad, criticism were not voiced or very, no, they were not voiced in a major way, because political correctness was then reigning. And this is in order to understand why political correctness was so strong in the Netherlands, not only in the Netherlands, by the way, also in Germany and other countries. This has to do with what we call, what we name in our book, the ethical revolution. The awareness from the 1960s especially about the atrocities of racism, be it the Holocaust or post-colonial or colonial atrocities in the Netherlands. People in Indonesia have shooting thousands and thousands of innocent men and young boys as a kind of a counter-guerrilla tactics by the Dutch army. This, let's say, this became so much part of the collective conscience that it was clear for almost all people in the Netherlands that one of the things you really had to avoid in a situation where there were minorities in your society is not to discriminate, not to stigmatize, because this could lead to what we've seen in the past. This was very strong, this ethical sense which informed this political correctness. Because this is what we were afraid of. There were some racist politicians, some in parliament, some outside of parliament. And also here you see this is a very broadly shared political correctness from left to right. There were not that many exceptions. And this also led to, just to give you one example of this political correctness, this is a quote from a social worker at the end of the 70s working with Moroccans in Amsterdam, who said, well, nobody had the guts to utter any criticism, whatever, once a Moroccan started to talk about his culture. I mean, so this I think, quite well illustrates the attitude of most people in the Netherlands. And this is also something that is part of the integration policies that then start, although you really have to realize that the 90% of the Dutch integration policy is not about identity, it's not about culture, but is about the hard sectors of social life. So most money goes into to reduce unemployment, for better housing, for education. That's where the money goes. But what is being remembered symbolically is this integration with retaining one's own cultural identity, etc. But this is not what the most of the integration policies of the Netherlands is about. Also because, let's say, politicians and civil servants realized very well how big the social problems in the 1980s were. So this political correctness was reigning, especially in the 1980s, but it evaporated. Sorry that I keep on. Yes, it evaporated at the end of the 1980s with the Rushdie affair. This was for the first time. I don't have to explain to you what the Rushdie affair was because it started in this country. But this was for the first time that Muslims inside our own society took to the streets and with demands that were seen as clearly, and not only seen as, which were clearly illiberal. Yeah? Against freedom of speech, banning a book, burning a book, backing up Khomeini's call to kill Salman Rushdie, etc., etc. And this came as a shock. This came as a great shock, especially for the left. The left, who had been fighting for all these liberal rights in the 1960s and the Cultural Revolution, and who then had been involved in this political correctness, because the left also did not want racism. And then what happened? These stupid Muslims were throwing their own glasses, as we say in the Netherlands. This citation, if one thing has become crystal clear, as thousands of Muslims are ranting and raving in the streets, it is the complete failure of multiracial, multicultural policy that politicians praised for so long. We spoiled them as poor souls and got them back as wolves. This is not a right-wing extremist. This is Gerrit Komrij. He's a left-wing poet, and you see very similar quotations in 1989 as a reaction to the Khomeini affair, the Rushdie affair, by leftist journalists, Jan Blokker, and well, Hein knows them, you don't. But I mean, these were really big figures on the left who started to talk so radical anti-Muslim. So it's interesting to see that the anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim rhetoric start on the left. And also to remember that Pim Fortuyn started almost as a communist. He was not admitted as a member of the Communist Party, but then for a long time, at this time, still was a member of the Labour Party. And it is not so strange. Again, from this idea that the Muslims were seen as a threat to everything for the liberal things they had fought for from the 1960s and 70s. We thought we were over religion. And then you get these fundamentalists and etc. So this is a very important watershed in political, in thinking about and talking about immigration and problems with integration. So it starts on the left, but very soon, and this is the brilliance of Pim Fortuyn, it was taken over by Pim Fortuyn, and also framed in a way that this was all to blame to the leftist church. So that's when, and this becomes a very strong, he's a brilliant politician in framing it in this way, although it goes against everything that we know as facts. Okay, so this very briefly, then the conclusion, because there I want to dwell 5 minutes, if you allow me, to make some comparisons also with the UK. So there are two questions that I addressed. One is how to explain the shift into anti-immigrant rhetorics in the Netherlands. Well, first of all, I think we have to realize that this shift is more in the talking, which is of course not unimportant, than in the real policies. If you look at policies, they have a much more continuity they display than a rupture. Secondly is that, well, if you want to explain it, of course you cannot avoid also talking about real social and cultural problems, however they have been, let's say, put out of the context, however they have been framed. but this is part of the experience of many people also, so you cannot ignore this. Thirdly, I think it has to do with, as I call this, evaporation of political correctness and the revanchism that then came afterwards. So many people who said, well, we were never allowed to talk about the real problems because we were blamed as racist, etc. Now, and so you see it really going to the other side. So there's a counter-reaction of a revanchism going on, also very much on the left. So people, for example, who worked as professionals in these neighborhoods, in the police or in medical care or in schools, who of course did see that things went wrong. I mean, but you could not talk about it. So political correctness has this counter effect. Then, but I stressed this in my talk, that we should not forget that this cultural discomfort with immigration, especially with immigration from Turkey and Morocco, was widely shared. It's not a right-wing thing. It's both also very much on the left. Well, if you then look at the UK, it's interesting to see that the UK is a very different development. At least we do not see the shift to anti-immigrant rhetorics in this same period. Well, to explain this, first of all, you have to look at the timing of the immigration. You have to realize that the big immigration wave to the UK already started in the early, well, at the end of the 40s, with people from Jamaica, etc. 50s, 60s, they are high, whereas in the Netherlands it's almost 20 years later. When it comes to the intensity of immigration. We have not, and we should not forget then, that of course there was also a very much an anti-immigrant reaction in the UK. Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, I mean, you know more about this than I do. So you could say that the UK already had this initial reaction, because this also was a reaction to governments which also did not allow to talk too much about problems and which play down. Randall Hansen, for example, has shown that very well in his 2000 book, for example. And then once one politician, and Powell was the Pim Fortuyn, I think, of the UK in the 1960s, also then mobilizing, let's say, these anti-immigrant feelings, especially also among Labour, and the voters for Labour, even more so, I think, than the voters for the Conservative Party. So the timing of immigration is important. Secondly, because for the Netherlands, or for the continent, European continent as a whole, you had this bad timing of the immigration when it comes to the economic cycle, more than in the UK, because it's... Well, secondly, the composition of the immigrants is different. The fact that the bulk of the immigrants in the UK are colonial immigrants really matters. That you can also see that within the Netherlands, you compare how people think about people from the colonies, from Suriname, and before that from the Dutch East Indies, but especially from Suriname. There is this colonial bonus, the fact that people already are partly socialized in the culture of the country where they go to, and when it comes to language and culture, but also how they are envisioned by, let's say, the population who receives these post-colonials. And especially, I think, in countries which consider themselves as empires or former empires, this is a very strong factor that downplays anti-immigrant feelings. Not entirely, and there are all kind of, but in general this plays a role. This is different for people coming from countries where there are no connections, colonial connections at all, like the Turks or the Moroccans. Then thirdly, and then I'll shut up, is that when you compare the UK and the Netherlands, the nature of the state is different, and I think in two respects. One, that continental states like the Netherlands are much more a welfare state than the UK is, or well, maybe once was, but so that neoliberalism has been much more important in the UK than on the continent. And this has, let's say, the negative effect is that immigrants are much easier and much quicker seen as profiting from the welfare system. Because if you have a welfare system, than people who do not contribute to the welfare system or only draw from the welfare system, if this is real or just in their heads. This can also create extra resentment. And there is closely connected to this is the fact that, and the Netherlands is a very good example of this, states who also want to solve these kind of social problems in a kind of social engineering way and want to measure integration. I mean, the Netherlands measure it every second almost. But by measuring it, which is well intended, because we want to solve the problem, but also by measuring it, we also stress the problem. And we highlight it time and again. So I don't have a solution for this, but there's a clear there's a clear difficulty with social engineering kind of problems, which, by the way, is much broader. If you look at the history of eugenics, for example, you see some very interesting parallels. And that's where I want to leave it.